many of the foreign fighters who went to fight for groups like ISIS, about 20% were female. And many of them were not from Muslim countries, but many of them were Western countries like France, Holland, even the United States, UK. So the question was, why would women who are living in these democratic, gender equal, relatively speaking at least, societies would like to go and join these groups where there is a lot of gender discrimination, at least perceived as such? So that was a big question that puzzled many people. We look at push and pull factors. Push factors are those structural elements in a society that push people towards these groups. Like, for example, discrimination, systemic discrimination, immigration laws, or feeling alienated. And pull factors are individual factors that motivate, that draw people to these things. For example, a sense of doing God's work. Another important element is to bring justice. There's this perceived hypocrisy in international system. There's Muslim groups that were colonized, exploited, so they justify use of violence, this methodology in their mind. So women also have certain factors. For example, a sense of sisterhood comes out as a very strong component, especially women who feel isolated, alienated in Western context where they don't feel they fit in. Then sense of sisterhood is a very important factor. So if you look at recruitment strategies on social media, they emphasize that a lot. But Western women, in addition to that religious and justice narrative, they also use adventure, romance. You could see there's an image in one of these magazines of a fighter, a mujahideen, with a little kitten in his hand to show this sort of tender, romantic fighters, really. Many women who join this group, one of the my research as well, other research find that they feel empowered, which may come as a surprise to us in the West because the way we define empowerment is very different. Women's rights in everywhere, we focus on equality, etc. But many of these women, it's ability to choose. They choose to join these groups. So that's a form of empowerment, but they also feel more respected. For example, if you're married to what they call a mujahid, a fighter, and the mujahid became a shaheed, died, a martyr, and if you have a son, then you are on top of the food chain, and then you are powerful, you have voice, you have respect, you have a sort of a control. One of the other things that ISIS have done is that they have a women's brigade, led and guided and run by women who are very strict. So they are the police for women, and they make sure that women are in line with the way ISIS defines the Islamic roles and rules. And the other thing that they've done, they have magazines. One of the magazines, for example, in each of their magazines, they have a section about women, for women, written by women. And so they look to address issues that they think is important for women. For example, in one of the editions, there's a manifesto, women's manifesto, of the sort of, ISIS woman. Some of the more conservative groups, like Al-Qaeda, Hamas, who were initially against the role of women in fighting, have been evolving for different reasons. They're increasingly started to use. And there are many reasons for this. For example, one reason is that women are, especially when you're group like a terrorist group, you need to attack soft targets. You need to have access to places. So if you're identified as a young male, you're much more easily searched. It is much harder for you to get into places. So what happens is that if you recruit a woman, like in Turkey, the PKK had once used a woman that looks pregnant on a bus as a suicide bomber. Women tend to go to places that are soft targets, like markets, whereas men go to more military targets. So if you look, for example, in Boko Haram, about 70% of the suicide bombers whose gender was able to be identified were female. And women Some of them as young as 7, they don't have political agency. Some of them are women who have been shamed in their societies to redeem themselves, but some of them are willing to do this on their own. So it's not one type of woman who joins these groups. Some of them are forced, abducted, but others are willing to join this group. And women in guerrilla groups tend to be much more violent and aggressive sometimes than men. And some researchers have I argue that this is we don't know exact reasons. We need to do more research. But one argument, one theoretical framework is that women, to prove their worth, they have to act more masculine. What is more associated with masculinity than violence? Therefore, to show that they're as good as men, they act more violent. Also, for example, in Iraq, women are used to recruit men and women to join these groups. There has been arrest of some women 50 years of age or above who were working to recruit. There in Pakistan, women have been stitching suicide bombs for people. And some of them believe in this as they're doing the right thing. Some of them want to support their family. Some of them are just, forced to do that. So we cannot say there's one type of woman who's involved in this. Historically, women have been involved in political violence from very early on. So it's not going away. And it may increase. More women have more mobility, more ability to travel on their own. Therefore, I think it's more likely to increase if we don't take care of this issue than to decrease. We have focused a lot on putting a Band-Aid, dealing with the symptoms, but we really never addressed the deep underlying causes of why this happens in the first place. How can we understand what is drawing these people to these groups? If we really want to address this issue for good, we really need to understand that. Because the more we exclude them, the more we push people, the more radicalized they become. The more we crush, the more we create these resentments and anger. There's some really successful reintegration programs that take into account social psychological healing, providing women with some of the skills that they need to integrate, because also, not necessarily with ISIS, but with FARC and with Tamil Tigers, women fighters had a harder time reintegrating back into society than males. And there were a couple of different reasons for that. One reason was that, first of all, because they were seen as an anomaly who are defying their traditional gender roles, they're more stigmatized than men for joining these groups. And many of these women who enjoyed some level of control, authority in these militant groups when they came out from this. So they had harder time, more emotional, more depression, and more difficulty in reintegrating than males. So we really need to understand, if we're reintegrating society, the different needs of men and different needs of women, and their unique sort of giving them options, and having lost that control that now they had, that people used to fear them, now they're treated as the lowest of the society, is a very big impact on their psychology as well. So it really has deep impacts on these women. Women can play an active role in countering violent extremism and bringing peace into their communities. And this has been increasingly recognized internationally, that when women meaningfully participate in peace processes, the chances of that peace agreement lasting 15 years or so increases about 35%, which is enormous. Of course, the meaningful is the important part. You don't want just to put a woman, just to have a woman. You want to be able to integrate women. Also, which woman? So not every woman understands the needs and challenges of other women. For example, in some societies where women have to learn to have more indirect communication, they develop dialogue skills as a result of the structure, the system that the ecosystem that they're operating in. So they may be much better in interpersonal, intergroup dialogues. Because they're perceived as non-threatening, they may have access to different communities, different groups that may not. For example, Betty Bigombe, who is not Muslim, but one of the things that she did was they thought she was crazy. She went and into the bushes to meet with the rebels. And they thought she was crazy. Because they thought she was crazy, she was not threatening, it was a woman, she was able to talk to them. And then go back to the government and talk to them. Similarly, an Iraqi woman, Fatima Bahadli, when her son joined one of these groups, she actually traveled to those regions. But being a mother, first of all, she was seen as non-threatening. So they were she was protected by that almost. So she was not attacked because she was not perceived as a threat. So she had access. She was able to reach and find her son. But the other thing that she did was that she realized that everyone who's in those groups are someone's daughter, someone's son. And that her approach is, rather than crashing them, but how do we understand why are they doing this? How do we convince them to come out of this and empower them? So she is interested in reintegrating, bringing them back into the society and addressing the root cause of this issue, rather than just crushing them, rather than this counter-terrorist approach that, focuses on that. Women of faith have unique contributions to make that are not available to secular women, as well as religious men when it comes to addressing religiously motivated violent extremism. When violence is perpetrated by using a religious ideology, secular arguments, secular methodologies do not provide the right way of responding to it. So you have to use the same framework in which is legitimate for them. So for that reason, if a religion was used to mobilize people to fight, then we have to counter that with a religion for peace. So there was this interest in religion and peace building. So the more I dug, the more I became fascinated, because there were so many women already doing amazing work in their communities, but their stories were not represented. Their perspective was not represented. They were actually sidelined. So, but
by who?
By, first of all, male religious leaders, government officials, Western organizations, including Western feminist groups. They usually was like, let's teach you how to resolve your conflicts. This liberal feminist women's movements from the West have been very dominant, and they have looked upon women of faith with some reservations. In fact, women of faith have been excluded mostly from peacemaking, especially when you think about Muslim women. The first image that comes to minds of many in the West are, hiding behind a veil, no sense of agency, in need of saving. We have to go and save these women. But the reality is so much more complex and different. It doesn't mean that women are having, even in the West, we have serious challenges to women's rights everywhere. So I was fascinated to find out how amazing work that they're doing. And some of the things that I've learned from them. First, secular women do not have legitimacy. They don't understand the worldview, whereas women of faith, who in Muslim context, who know the religion, who knows these texts, can develop counter arguments and face the people's narratives. And actually, there are amazing women in Nigeria, in Iraq, who've been doing that. And so they have that unique legitimacy as mothers, as people who understand the context, who know the history. They understand the sensitivities of their society. They know who to contact. They have not only the legitimacy, but the know-how. So one of the things that you find out is that women are very good at understanding and adapting to their context in their societies. The second thing that's unique to women of faith, but not for imams, is that they have sensitivity and access to women who are also, one, victims, who have been raped, who have been subjected to gender-based violence. They can talk about those things with women much more comfortably. They understand their issues, so they can bring, which is a huge issue, gender-based violence at times of conflict is a very big issue that needs to be addressed, which is often overlooked. Another thing is that they also have access to women fighters who they can talk and understand why they're joining. They can understand their concerns. They can understand where they're coming from. And they can sort of, because of that access, that they actually can sort of sometimes convince them to sort of disengage. They have been able to convince some of them and providing them with other job opportunities rather than doing that to sort of counter what they were doing. So there's amazing work being done. While they may look powerless because they don't have access to official decision making, because they're perceived as non-threatening, they can actually access more spaces and convince more people. So this is actually, they perceive this as a strategic invisibility where it actually gives them a lot of power. So how we look at what power is, what empowerment is, we need to have a broader understanding of that. So power is not one-dimensional. It's how you can impact your situation comes from many different sources. So these women have been able to understand their own unique sense of power, their connection, status. I mean, we look at power as not only military force, but as status, as knowledge. I mean, power has many different dimensions. So they were able to combine their gender power, being women as mothers, for example, as being not threatening, their role in society as mothers, their status, maybe family status, connections, religious connections, as well as their knowledge in Islam and other societal factors. They combine them. And as an important source of power, they use this to bring peace in their communities and counter violent extremism. If you want your peace to be sustainable, any intervention to be sustainable, it has to be meaningful. It has to be rooted in that society's cultural, historical, and symbolic frameworks, basically. First of all, I think Muslim world has a responsibility to address some of these problems themselves too. Muslim leaders, we have a lot of internal conflicts, internal divisions within the Muslim world that needs to be addressed. And we need to not leave this only to the Western society. But doesn't mean that West has no role to play. I mean, societies evolve and change through interaction from learning from each other, but that has to be a two-way road rather than one-way road. I think there's so many things that we can learn from each other. If you look, many of these scientific advances that happened in the West came from Islamic tradition, which before that came from China and India. So societies evolve and progress through positive interaction, recognizing women's contributions, especially giving voice to those marginalized, most overlooked groups like the women of faith is really important. I think that would be, and to being more willing to have an open mind is, I think, something that's very important.